Airport workers rushed the disabled veteran until they noticed his Congressional Medal of Honor. Act 1. Richmond International Airport on a Thursday morning was controlled chaos. Travelers rushing to gates, TSA lines snaking through the terminal, the constant drone of announcements about delays in boarding and security protocols. Gate C-14 was particularly crowded, the flight to Washington D.C. running late due to mechanical issues. Passengers bunched in the waiting area, with the particular frustration of people whose schedules were being disrupted. Thomas Brennan sat in the designated wheelchair assistance area, waiting for his escort to the gate. He was 76 years old, his left leg ending just below the knee, a prosthetic visible when his pants leg shifted during movement. His right arm was scarred from shoulder to wrist, the skin showing the mottled pattern of severe burns that had healed decades ago, but never fully recovered. He used a cane, even with the prosthetic, his balance compromised by old injuries that went deeper than what was visible. He wore a simple blue suit, slightly outdated in cut, maintained with care but showing age, a white shirt, a navy tie with small American flags, and pinned to his lapel, a small distinctive medal that most people didn't recognize but that carried weight beyond measure. The Congressional Medal of Honor, light blue ribbon, 13 white stars, the figure of Minerva in the center, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. Thomas had worn it only a handful of times in the 48 years since receiving it. Today was necessary. He was traveling to D.C. for a ceremony honoring Vietnam veterans, and the organizers had specifically requested that Medal of Honor recipients wear their decoration. So he'd pinned it on that morning, feeling the familiar weight of not just the medal, but everything it represented. An airport customer service representative approached, young woman, maybe 25, wearing the airline uniform and an expression of harried efficiency. Her name tag read, Melissa. "Mr. Brennan, I'm here to assist you to the gate. We're running behind schedule, so we need to move quickly." "I understand. I'm ready." She grabbed the handles of his wheelchair without asking, began pushing at a pace that suggested she had 3 other passengers to escort, and was already late. Thomas gripped his cane, uncomfortable with the speed, but not wanting to complain. They moved through the terminal, Melissa weaving between travelers with the aggressive efficiency of someone who navigated crowds professionally. She was checking her phone with one hand, steering with the other, her attention divided. "Excuse me, coming through, wheelchair assistance, please move aside." Travelers parted, most barely glancing at the disabled veteran being rushed past. A few looked annoyed at having to move, treating the wheelchair as an inconvenience rather than a person. At the security checkpoint, Melissa spoke to the TSA agent with clipped impatience. "Wheelchair passenger, needs expedited screening, flight's already boarding." The TSA agent, a middle-aged man named Robert, whose badge showed 20 years of service, gestured Thomas forward. "Sir, I'll need you to stand if you can, or we'll need to do a full pat-down." Thomas stood carefully, using his cane, the prosthetic leg clearly visible as his pants shifted. Robert began the standard screening, metal detector wand, checking his shoes, his belt, standard procedure. Then the wand passed over Thomas's chest and beeped at the metal. "Sir, you have something metal on your jacket. I'll need you to remove it." "It's a medal," Thomas said quietly. "I can unpin it if necessary." "Yes, please remove it and place it in the bin." Thomas reached up, began unpinning the Medal of Honor with hands that shook slightly, not from age but from something else, some old weight that made this simple action difficult. As he removed it, Melissa shifted impatiently, checking her watch. "We really need to keep moving. The flight's boarding now." Robert took the medal to scan it, and in that moment, his eyes actually focused on what he was holding, the light blue ribbon, the distinctive star configuration, the figure of Minerva representing valor. His expression changed completely, from routine boredom to sudden, profound attention. "Sir, this is the Medal of Honor." "Yes." Robert's entire demeanor shifted. He stood straighter, his voice taking on a different quality, not just professional, but reverent. "Sir, you didn't need to remove this. Medal of Honor recipients are exempt from standard screening protocols. I apologize for not recognizing it immediately." "It's all right. Most people don't know what it looks like." Melissa had stopped checking her phone, was now staring at the medal in Robert's hands. "What's the Medal of Honor?" Robert looked at her with an expression that suggested disappointment in the education system. "It's the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. It's given for valor in action against an enemy force, for acts of heroism so extraordinary that they're beyond the call of duty. There are fewer than 70 living recipients." He handed the medal back to Thomas with both hands, with the careful respect reserved for sacred objects. "Sir, thank you for your service, and I apologize again for the confusion." Thomas pinned the medal back on his lapel, hands still shaking slightly. "No apology necessary. You were doing your job." A small crowd had gathered, other TSA agents, a few travelers, airport staff. Word was spreading through whispers. Medal of Honor recipient, Vietnam probably. Valor in combat, look at his injuries. Melissa was pale, suddenly understanding that she'd been rushing a national hero through the airport like he was an inconvenient package to deliver. "Mr. Brennan, I didn't realize—" "You didn't know. It's fine. But I should have been more careful, more respectful. You've been through so much, and I was just pushing you like a passenger who needed to get to his gate," Thomas finished gently. "Which is what I am. The medal doesn't change that I need to catch a flight." An older TSA supervisor had appeared, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, who'd been watching from her station. She approached Thomas, and unlike the others, she didn't look at the medal first. She looked at his face, his injuries, the way he held himself. "Sir, I'm Patricia Chen, TSA supervisor. We have a protocol for Medal of Honor recipients. Would you allow me to arrange a proper escort to your gate? Not rushed, not hurried, with the respect your service deserves." "That's not necessary." "It's not about necessity, sir. It's about what's right." She turned to Melissa. "Go help your other passengers. I'll personally escort Mr. Brennan." Melissa nodded, looking grateful for the dismissal and ashamed of her earlier behavior. She disappeared into the crowd, and Patricia took position beside Thomas's wheelchair. "Mr. Brennan, would you prefer to walk with your cane, or would you like me to push the chair at a comfortable pace?" "I can walk. The chair was just easier to arrange." "Then let's walk together. Your flight can wait. They're not leaving without a Medal of Honor recipient." As they moved through the terminal, slowly now, respectfully, other travelers noticed the medal. A few pointed it out to their companions. Some stood aside with visible respect. One man, maybe 60, wearing a Marine Corps veteran cap, stood at attention as Thomas passed and saluted. Thomas nodded to him, the acknowledgement of one veteran to another, and the man's eyes glistened with emotion. Patricia walked beside him, maintaining a comfortable pace, not rushing, not pushing. After a moment of silence, she spoke. "My father was in Vietnam. He didn't make it home. Died in '69, Operation Dewey Canyon. I never got to know him. I'm sorry for your loss. He wrote letters to my mother. She kept them all, let me read them when I was old enough. He wrote about the brotherhood, about the men he served with, about how they looked after each other. He wrote about being scared but doing the job anyway." She paused. "He wrote about men like you, I think, the ones who did extraordinary things in impossible circumstances." "I wasn't extraordinary," Thomas said quietly. "I was just in the wrong place at the right time, or the right place at the wrong time. Depends on perspective. The Medal of Honor isn't awarded for being in a place. It's awarded for what you do when you're there." They arrived at gate C-14, where the boarding process had slowed. The gate agent, a woman in her 40s named Sandra, saw Patricia approaching with Thomas and immediately understood something significant was happening. Patricia spoke quietly to Sandra, pointing to the medal on Thomas's lapel. Sandra's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, respect, something approaching awe. She made an announcement over the gate speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special passenger flying with us today. I'd like to ask everyone to please stand and recognize Mr. Thomas Brennan, a Medal of Honor recipient and veteran who served our country with extraordinary valor." The gate area went silent, then erupted in applause. Passengers stood, businessmen in suits, families with children, college students, elderly couples, all rising to honor a man most of them had never heard of, but understood represented something larger than himself. Thomas stood still, leaning on his cane, uncomfortable with the attention, but understanding it wasn't really about him. It was about what the medal represented: sacrifice, heroism, the willingness to risk everything for others. It was about all the men who'd served and not come home, all the families who'd lost fathers and sons and brothers. The applause continued for a full minute, and Thomas felt the weight he always carried, not just the physical weight of injuries sustained 48 years ago, but the moral weight of surviving when so many others hadn't, of being honored when so many heroes were forgotten. When the applause finally died down, Sandra approached. "Mr. Brennan, we'd like to pre-board you, give you time to settle in comfortably." "That's not necessary. I can wait with everyone else." "Sir, with respect, it's not about necessity. It's about honoring your service. Please." Thomas nodded, allowing himself to be escorted down the jetway. Behind him, passengers were whispering, asking each other what he'd done to earn the medal, speculating about battles and heroism and sacrifice. But none of them knew. None of them could know what that small piece of metal and ribbon really represented. Not just what he'd done on one day in 1971, but everything that came after. The survival when survival felt like betrayal. The living with decisions made in seconds that echoed for decades. The carrying of names and faces that never aged while he grew old. As Thomas settled into his seat, first class, upgraded without asking, he touched the metal on his lapel and felt all of it. The weight that never truly lifted but that, on days like this, felt almost bearable. Because at least people were trying to understand. At least they were pausing to recognize that the metal meant something. Even if they couldn't fully comprehend what. Ace Tour 2. The flight to D.C. was quiet for Thomas, seated in 1A, watching clouds through the window and thinking about the ceremony he was traveling to attend. 50 years since the fall of Saigon, honoring Vietnam veterans, recognizing sacrifice that had gone unrecognized for too long. He'd debated attending. The last few ceremonies had been difficult, seeing old friends who'd aged as he had, talking about battles and losses, carrying weight together that felt heavier each year. But this, one was significant, and they'd specifically requested Medal of Honor recipients. So, he'd come, and he'd worn the medal, which he almost never did. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s named Karen, approached with coffee. "Mr. Brennan, I wanted to thank you for your service. My brother served in Afghanistan. He made it home, but he struggled. Seeing your medal, understanding that even heroes carry scars, it helps somehow. How is your brother doing?" "Better. Took years of VA treatment, support groups, family patience, but better. He's working now, married, has a baby on the way. It took time. It always takes time. Tell him I'm proud of him for doing the work, for pushing through. That takes its own kind of courage." Karen nodded, fighting tears. "I will. Thank you." After she left, the passenger across the aisle, a man in his 30s, expensive suit, clearly business traveler, leaned over. "Excuse me, sir. I couldn't help but notice your medal. I'm embarrassed to admit I don't know the full significance. Would you be willing to share what it represents?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to say. "It's the Medal of Honor. It's awarded for valor in action against an enemy force, acts of heroism that go beyond the call of duty." "What did you do to earn it?" The question everyone asked. The question Thomas had answered 1,000 times and still never found adequate words for. How do you explain seconds of action that defied rational thought, that came from instinct and training and desperation rather than conscious choice? "I was in Vietnam, 1971. My unit was ambushed, pinned down by enemy fire. We had wounded who couldn't be evacuated, and we were about to be overrun. I did what needed doing, neutralized the enemy positions, held them off long enough for helicopters to extract the wounded." The businessman waited, understanding there was more. And 3 men died holding that position with me. 4 others were wounded badly enough to be medically discharged. I survived with these injuries," he gestured to his leg and arm, "and got a medal. The math doesn't seem fair." "But you saved lives." "I survived. The men who died are the ones who should be remembered." A voice from behind them. "May I join this conversation?" An older man, maybe 70, with a weathered face and calm eyes. "I'm Richard Collins. I was Army Vietnam, 68 to 70. When I saw your medal, I wanted to introduce myself." Thomas gestured to the empty seat next to him. "Please." Richard moved over, settled in. "I've known 3 Medal of Honor recipients in my life. Every single one of them said exactly what you just said, that they survived while others died, that the medal doesn't seem fair. You know why they all say that? Why? Because the kind of action that earns the Medal of Honor is the kind where survival feels like luck rather than skill, where you're doing things that should get you killed and somehow you don't die while others around you do, and that leaves weight that's hard to carry." Thomas looked at him directly. "You understand?" "I do. I didn't earn a Medal of Honor, but I earned a Silver Star for an action where 2 of my friends died. I've spent 50 years wondering why I lived and they didn't. Why I got a medal for surviving when they got flag-draped coffins." The businessman looked between them, beginning to understand that this conversation was about something deeper than he'd initially thought. "Is that common? The guilt about surviving?" "Survivor's guilt," Richard said. "Every combat veteran carries some version of it. But Medal of Honor recipients carry a particular weight because their survival required extraordinary action, and that action is usually connected to others dying. They're honored for moments when the best they could do still wasn't enough to save everyone. Thomas nodded slowly. 3 men, Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington. They were with me at the position we were holding. Rodriguez was 20 years old, from California. Chen was 22, engaged to be married. Washington was 19, had a baby daughter he'd never met. All 3 died in the action that earned me this medal. He touched the decoration on his lapel. This medal and ribbon, it's not just recognition for what I did. It's a memorial for what they did. Every time I wear it, I'm carrying their names, their sacrifice. That's the real weight. Richard understood. How many men did you save that day? These 15, wounded, pinned down, about to be overrun or captured. The helicopters got them out because we held the position long enough. So 3 died so 15 could live. That's the math that haunts you. Yes. But consider this. Those 15 men went home, had families, careers, lives. Some of them probably have grandchildren now. How many people exist today because those 15 men survived? 50, 100, more? Thomas had thought about this calculation countless times over 48 years. I know the utilitarian argument, 3 deaths to save 15 lives, and those 15 lives created more lives, so the net result is positive. But knowing that doesn't make the faces go away, doesn't make Rodriguez's last words disappear, doesn't stop me from thinking about Chen's fiancée who had to be told he wasn't coming home, doesn't erase Washington's daughter growing up without a father. The businessman spoke quietly. What were Rodriguez's last words? Thomas was silent for a long moment. He said, "Don't let them get past us." He was bleeding out from a chest wound, knew he was dying, and his last thought was making sure the enemy didn't reach our wounded. He died protecting people who were already wounded, who couldn't protect themselves. That's who Rodriguez was. And you honor him by remembering. I honor him by living, by making sure his death meant something, by being present for the families of men who died, by supporting veterans who need help, by trying to be worthy of surviving when better men didn't. Thomas's voice was steady but carried weight. That's what this medal really means. It's not a celebration. It's a responsibility. Karen, the flight attendant, had been listening from nearby. She approached with tears in her eyes. "Sir, would you be willing to share your story with more passengers? I think people need to hear this, need to understand what the medal represents." Thomas was uncomfortable with the idea, but Richard encouraged him. "They need to hear it, Thomas. This generation doesn't understand what Vietnam was, what it cost. They need to hear from someone who was there." Reluctantly, Thomas agreed. Karen made an announcement over the PA system, and within minutes a small crowd had gathered in the first-class cabin. Passengers from throughout the plane, standing in the aisles, sitting in empty seats, listening. Thomas spoke for 20 minutes, talking about Vietnam, about the action that earned him the medal, about Rodriguez and Chen and Washington, about the 15 men who survived, about coming home to a country that didn't want to hear about the war, about decades of carrying weight quietly because society wasn't ready to acknowledge what veterans had endured. He talked about the other costs, failed marriages because he couldn't stop seeing combat when he closed his eyes, career struggles because his injuries and PTSD made normal work difficult, relationships strained because he carried names and faces that kept him distant from people who couldn't understand. "The Medal of Honor changed my life," Thomas said quietly. "It opened doors, earned respect, created opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise. But it also marked me, made me representative of something larger than myself. Every time someone sees this medal, they see heroism, valor, sacrifice. They don't see the man underneath who's just trying to live with what he's done and what he's seen." A young woman, maybe 25, asked, "Do you consider yourself a hero?" Thomas thought carefully. "I consider myself a survivor who did what needed doing in an impossible situation. Heroes is what we call the dead, the ones who gave everything. I just gave parts and kept living. That makes me lucky, not heroic." "But you saved 15 men. I tried to save 18. 3 of them died anyway. That's what I remember most, not the 15 who lived, but the 3 who didn't. Not the successful actions, but the moments when my best wasn't good enough." An older man, military bearing evident despite civilian clothes, spoke up. "Sir, I'm retired Army, 30 years of service. I've studied Medal of Honor actions, used them in leadership training. What you did that day was objectively extraordinary. You single-handedly held off an enemy force for 40 minutes while wounded, allowing extraction of 15 casualties. That's not luck. That's skill, courage, and determination." Thomas met his eyes. "I appreciate that. But I need you to understand something. The actions that earn medals of honor, they're not calculated, not planned. They're instinctive responses to impossible situations. You don't think, I'm going to be heroic now. You think, my friends are dying, I have to do something. It's desperation as much as courage, fear as much as determination. And when it's over, when you survive and others don't, the medal feels like a weight more than an honor. The retired Army officer nodded slowly. I understand. Thank you for sharing that perspective. The conversation continued until the plane began its descent into D.C. Passengers returned to their seats, but the atmosphere had changed. These strangers had glimpsed something they'd never seen before, the human cost of heroism, the weight carried by someone who'd been honored for actions that haunted him decades later. As they prepared to land, Richard leaned over. Thomas, you did good work today. Those people needed to hear what you said, needed to understand that heroes aren't invincible, that medals come with costs, that survival isn't always the victory it appears to be. I hope I didn't burden them with too much. You gave them truth. That's never a burden. It's a gift. Act 3. The taxi from Reagan National to the hotel took Thomas through familiar D.C. streets, monuments and memorials, government buildings, the physical manifestation of American power and ideals. He'd been here dozens of times over the decades for ceremonies and events and reunions, and each visit carried its own weight. At the hotel, the check-in clerk saw his medal and immediately upgraded him to a suite, refusing to accept payment for the upgrade. Sir, it's the least we can do. Thank you for your service. Thomas had learned to accept these gestures gracefully, understanding they came from genuine respect, even if they made him uncomfortable. Thank you. The suite was more space than he needed, but the view was good, overlooking the National Mall, the monuments visible in the distance. Thomas stood at the window, thinking about the ceremony tomorrow, about seeing old friends, about carrying weight together. His phone rang, a familiar voice. Thomas, it's Robert Martinez, just confirming you're in town for tomorrow. Robert had been one of the 15 men extracted that day in 1971. He was 69 now, retired postal worker, grandfather of 7. He'd stayed in touch with Thomas over the decades, one of several survivors who'd maintained contact with the man who'd saved their lives. I'm here, got in about an hour ago. How are you feeling? These events can be difficult. I'm all right, tired from the travel, but all right. Listen, several of us who were there that day, we want to have dinner with you tonight. Just us, no ceremony, no speeches, just brothers sharing a meal. Are you up for it? Thomas felt emotion tighten his throat. I'd like that. Thank you. Vietnamese restaurant, actually. Little place in Arlington. Figured we'd embrace the irony of surviving Vietnam only to go back for the food. What time? 7. I'll text you the address. At 7 p.m., Thomas entered a small restaurant where 5 men waited, all in their late 60s and early 70s, all carrying the particular bearing of combat veterans, all survivors of the action that had earned Thomas his medal. Robert Martinez, who'd organized the dinner. James Washington Jr., son of one of the men who'd died, carrying his father's name forward. Michael Chen, nephew of the Chen who'd died, wanting to meet the man who'd tried to save his uncle. And 2 others, David Peterson and Marcus Green, who'd been among the 15 extracted that day. They embraced Thomas, brothers reunited by shared history and shared trauma. For the first hour, they ate and talked about ordinary things. Families, grandchildren, health struggles, the small joys and frustrations of aging. No one mentioned Vietnam, no one referenced the action, no one talked about medals or heroism. Then, after the meal, after the table had been cleared and only tea remained, Robert spoke. Thomas, we wanted to do this tonight because tomorrow's going to be hard. Big ceremony, lots of people, everyone wanting to hear war stories and shake hands. Tonight is just us, just the men who were there, who understand what that day really meant. Thomas nodded, waiting. We know you carry weight, David said. We know you think about Rodriguez and Chen and Washington every day. We know you wonder if you did enough, if you could have saved them, if the 3 deaths were worth the 15 lives saved. We're here to tell you something, Marcus added, something we need you to hear, even if you don't fully believe it. You gave us our lives back, not just survival, lives. I have 3 children who exist because you held that position. I have grandchildren. David has 5 grandchildren. Robert has 7. Between the 15 men who were extracted that day, we've collectively created families that total over 200 people. Children, grandchildren, some great-grandchildren now. 200 people who wouldn't exist if you'd let that position fall, Robert said. 200 lives that are your legacy, whether you accept that or not. Thomas felt his hands shaking, the old tremor that appeared when emotion overwhelmed his carefully maintained control. But Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington, they would want you to live, James Washington Jr. interrupted. My father, I never knew him, grew up with just stories and photographs, but I've read his letters, talked to men who served with him. He was a man who believed in duty, in protecting others, in doing what needed doing regardless of cost. If he could see you now, carrying guilt for surviving, carrying weight for his death, he'd tell you to let it go. He'd tell you he made his choice, did his duty, and you honored him by living well. Michael Chen spoke next, his voice thick with emotion. My uncle, I never met him. He died 2 months before I was born. But my family has always known about you, about what you tried to do, about how you've carried his name for 48 years. Every Memorial Day, every anniversary, you send my grandmother a card. You remember his birthday. You've made sure he's not forgotten. That matters more than you can know. Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't process the weight of what he was hearing. These men, these families, trying to lighten the burden he'd carried for nearly 5 decades. We're not here to tell you to forget, Robert said gently. We're here to tell you that your survival wasn't a betrayal. It was a gift to us, to our families, to everyone whose lives you've touched since then. The guilt you carry, the weight you bear. We understand it, but we also need you to understand that you've earned the right to live without that crushing weight. You've honored their memories. You've lived well. You've given back. David pulled out a folder, opened it to show photographs. These are our families. Every person in these photos exists because you held that position 48 years ago. We wanted you to see them, to understand the scope of what you did. The photographs showed children and grandchildren, weddings and graduations, babies and birthday parties. Dozens of faces, all connected through a single action on a single day in 1971, when one man held a position against impossible odds and 15 men got extracted. Thomas looked at each photograph, his vision blurring with tears he'd been holding back for decades. I didn't know. I knew theoretically, but seeing it makes it real, Marcus said. That's why we wanted to show you. Tomorrow, when you're at the ceremony, when people are thanking you and honoring you, we want you to remember these faces. These are the lives your actions created. This is what the Medal of Honor really represents. Not just the 15 men you saved, but everyone those men created, everyone they touched, everyone who exists because you didn't let that position fall. They spent another 2 hours together, sharing stories, talking about lives lived, acknowledging losses, but also celebrating survival and what survival had created. When they finally parted, each man embraced Thomas with the fierce affection of brothers who'd survived hell together and understood that survival was both gift and burden. Walking back to his hotel, Thomas felt different, not lighter. The weight was still there, would always be there, but redistributed somehow, shared across broader shoulders, understood by people who recognized what carrying it meant. In his suite, he looked at the Medal of Honor sitting on the dresser. Light blue ribbon, 13 stars, the figure of Minerva representing valor. Such a small object to carry so much weight. He thought about Rodriguez's last words. Don't let them get past us. About Chen's fiancée who'd had to build a life without him. About Washington's daughter, now 51 years old, married with children of her own, who'd grown up with only photographs and stories. But he also thought about the photographs he'd seen tonight. 200 people across 3 generations, all existing because 15 men had been extracted, because 3 men had died holding a position, because 1 man had survived to carry the weight forward. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe the survival wasn't betrayal. Maybe living well, helping others, honoring the fallen through decades of service. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what Rodriguez and Chen and Washington would have wanted. Thomas picked up the medal, held it in his scarred hand, and for the first time in 48 years, felt something other than pure weight. Not absence of weight, that would never happen, but purpose. Understanding that the weight had meaning, that carrying it forward had created value, that survival had been transformed into legacy. I tried, he said quietly to the 3 men whose faces still appeared in his dreams. I tried to save you, and I failed, but I didn't fail the others. And I've tried to live in a way that honored your sacrifice. I hope that's enough. The suite was quiet, just the hum of air conditioning and distant traffic. But in that quiet, Thomas felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel. Peace. Not forgiveness. He'd never fully forgive himself for surviving when better men died. But peace. Acceptance that he'd carried the weight as well as he could. That his survival had meant something. that Rodriguez and Chen and Washington's deaths had created ripples that extended far beyond that single day in 1971. Tomorrow he'd go to the ceremony. He'd wear the medal, shake hands with dignitaries, stand with other Medal of Honor recipients. He'd represent something larger than himself: valor, sacrifice, heroism. But tonight, in this quiet suite, he was just Thomas Brennan, survivor, carrier of names and faces. A man who'd done extraordinary things in impossible circumstances and spent 48 years trying to understand what that meant and whether it was enough. And for the first time in decades, he thought maybe, just maybe, it was. A Sitaor, the legacy. The ceremony took place at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the black granite wall that held 58,000 names of Americans who died in the war. Thomas stood with 7 other Medal of Honor recipients, old men now, bodies showing the wear of decades and injuries, but standing straight, wearing their medals with quiet dignity. The crowd was large, thousands of veterans, families, civilians who'd come to honor service that had gone unrecognized for too long. 50 years since the fall of Saigon, finally acknowledging the sacrifice, finally offering the respect that should have been given decades earlier. The ceremony included speeches from politicians and military leaders, music from a Marine Corps band, and testimonials from veterans. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he approached the podium slowly, leaning on his cane, the Medal of Honor visible on his lapel. He looked out at the crowd. So many faces, so many stories, so much collective trauma and resilience and survival. And he thought about what to say, how to honor not just the men who died, but the ones who'd lived, who'd carried weight forward, who'd survived when survival felt like betrayal. My name is Thomas Brennan. I received the Medal of Honor for actions in Vietnam in 1971. But I'm not here today to talk about heroism or valor. I'm here to talk about weight. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Every person who served in Vietnam carries weight. The weight of what we saw, what we did, what we survived. The weight of friends who didn't come home. The weight of a country that didn't want to hear our stories, that treated us with indifference or hostility when we returned. We carried that weight quietly for decades because society wasn't ready to acknowledge it. 3 men died in the action that earned me this medal: Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington. 20, 22, and 19 years old, respectively. They died holding a position so 15 other men could be evacuated. I survived. I got a medal. They got folded flags and remembered grief. That math has haunted me for 48 years. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on every word. But last night, I had dinner with some of the men who were evacuated that day. They showed me photographs of their families, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Over 200 people who exist because 3 men died, and 15 men lived, and 1 man survived to carry the guilt forward. They told me my survival wasn't betrayal. They told me I'd earned the right to live without crushing weight. They told me that honoring the dead meant living well, helping others, making the sacrifice mean something beyond just grief. Thomas's voice broke slightly. I don't know if I believe them yet. I don't know if I'll ever fully let go of the weight, but I'm trying, and I want everyone here to understand something. If you served in Vietnam, if you carry weight from that service, you're not alone. We all carry it together, and the weight has meaning. It connects us to brothers who fell, to sacrifice that mattered, to service that should be honored regardless of how the war ended. This medal, he touched it gently. It's not just recognition for what I did on one day. It's a memorial for what Rodriguez and Chen and Washington did, for what thousands of men and women did in impossible circumstances. It represents not just heroism, but the cost of heroism, the weight that comes with survival, the responsibility to honor the fallen through how we live. So, to everyone here who served, who lost friends, who came home carrying weight, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. Thank you for carrying the weight forward. You're all heroes, whether you have medals or not. You all matter, whether your names are on this wall or not. You all deserve recognition, respect, and the understanding that what you endured has meaning. And to the families of those who didn't come home, whose names are on this wall behind me, your loved ones are not forgotten. We carry them with us. Every day, every moment, we carry their names and their faces and their sacrifice. They live on in our memories, in our stories, in the weight we bear. That's not much consolation, I know, but it's what we can offer: eternal remembrance, eternal gratitude, eternal respect for what they gave. Thomas stepped back from the podium, and the applause was thunderous. Thousands of people standing, honoring not just his words, but everything they represented: the acknowledgement of weight, the recognition of sacrifice, the understanding that heroism came with costs that extended far beyond the battlefield. After the ceremony, Thomas stood at the wall, finding the names. Rodriguez, Chen, Washington. He touched each one, feeling the cold granite, thinking about 3 young men who died holding a position 48 years ago. "I'm still here," he said quietly, "still carrying you forward, still trying to make it mean something, still honoring your sacrifice by living well and helping others and making sure you're remembered. I hope that's enough. I hope you'd be proud." A hand on his shoulder, James Washington Jr., son of the man whose name was on the wall. He would be proud. I know he would be. They stood together, 2 generations connected by sacrifice and survival, by names on walls and medals on lapels, by weight carried forward across decades. Closing, Thomas Brennan returned to his life in Richmond, but something had changed. The dinner with the survivors, the ceremony at the wall, the photographs of 200 lives created by 15 extractions, it had shifted something in how he carried the weight. The guilt didn't disappear. The names still echoed. Rodriguez, Chen, Washington, they would always be there, would always haunt quiet moments. But alongside them now were other names. The 15 men who survived, their children and grandchildren, everyone whose existence traced back to a single action on a single day. The airport workers who'd rushed him, then honored him, started a tradition. Every Medal of Honor recipient passing through Richmond International received special treatment, not rushed, not hurried, but escorted with respect and gratitude. Melissa, the customer service rep who'd initially pushed Thomas's wheelchair too quickly, became an advocate for veteran services at the airport, using her experience as motivation to do better. Patricia Chen, the TSA supervisor whose father had died in Vietnam, reached out to Thomas. They met for coffee, and Thomas shared stories about her father's generation, about men who'd served with courage and returned to indifference. Patricia recorded their conversations, creating an oral history that she shared with her family, ensuring her father's service was properly honored. Robert Martinez and the other survivors established a scholarship fund in honor of Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington, supporting descendants of Vietnam veterans, ensuring the sacrifice was remembered through education and opportunity. Thomas contributed to the fund, but insisted his name not be attached to it. "This is about them, not me," he said. The passengers from the flight to D.C. spread Thomas's story through their own networks. The businessman wrote an article about meeting a Medal of Honor recipient, about learning that heroism came with weight, that medals represented not just valor, but the burden of survival. The article went viral, prompting discussions about how society honors veterans, how we understand sacrifice, how we support those who carry weight forward. Karen, the flight attendant whose brother had struggled after Afghanistan, shared Thomas's words with her brother. "Even heroes carry scars," Thomas had said. "That takes its own kind of courage." Her brother found those words meaningful, used them in his own work, helping other veterans understand that struggling wasn't weakness, that seeking help was strength, that survival and healing were both forms of courage. Thomas received invitations to speak at schools, veterans organizations, civic groups. He accepted some, wanting to ensure Vietnam veterans received recognition, but uncomfortable with the spotlight. When he did speak, he always made the same points. Heroism has costs, survival can feel like betrayal, weight is real but shareable, and honoring the fallen means living well and helping others. He visited Rodriguez's family in California, Chen's family in New York, Washington's family in Georgia, making sure they knew their loved ones were remembered, that their sacrifice still mattered 48 years later. Each family welcomed him, thanked him for decades of remembrance, introduced him to children and grandchildren who carried the names and legacies forward. At 78, Thomas's health began declining. The prosthetic leg caused increasing problems. The old injuries accumulated more pain. The decades of carrying weight took their toll. But his mind remained sharp, his commitment to honoring the fallen unwavering. He wrote letters to the 15 men who'd been evacuated, thanking them for the dinner in D.C., for the photographs, for helping him understand that survival had meaning. He wrote to James Washington Jr. and Michael Chen, thanking them for honoring their father and uncle by living well and carrying the legacy forward. And he wrote final letters to Rodriguez's, Chen's, and Washington's families. Long, detailed accounts of the men they'd been, the courage they'd shown, the way they died protecting others. "I've carried them with me for 48 years, Thomas wrote. "Now I want to make sure you have every detail, every memory, every story. They deserve to be remembered completely, not just as names on a wall, but as the young men they were, full of life and hope and dedication to something larger than themselves." Thomas Brennan died peacefully at 79 in his sleep, the Medal of Honor on his nightstand, where he could see it last thing at night and first thing in the morning. His funeral was attended by hundreds, the 15 survivors and their families, descendants of Rodriguez and Chen and Washington, veterans from multiple generations, strangers who'd heard his story and been moved by it. The eulogy was given by Robert Martinez, who spoke about a man who'd saved his life and then spent 48 years honoring the men who died saving others. Thomas carried weight that would have crushed most people, but he carried it with dignity, with purpose, with understanding that survival created responsibility. He honored the fallen by living well, by helping others, by making sure their sacrifice meant something beyond just grief. The Medal of Honor on his chest represented extraordinary valor, but the real measure of Thomas Brennan was how he lived the 48 years after earning it, constantly remembering, constantly honoring, constantly serving. That's the legacy he leaves us, not just heroism in combat, but dedication in life, commitment to making survival mean something. Thomas was buried with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, the Medal of Honor displayed at the service, his grave positioned where he'd requested, near the Vietnam Memorial section, close to the names of Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington. His headstone was simple: Thomas Brennan, 1948-2027, Medal of Honor, recipient Vietnam War. He carried them forward. The inscription was at James Washington Jr.'s suggestion, approved by Chen's and Rodriguez's families. It captured the essence of Thomas's life, not just the heroic action that earned the medal, but the decades of carrying forward the names and memories of men who died, ensuring they were honored through service and remembrance. The 15 survivors established an annual gathering at Arlington on the anniversary of the action that saved their lives. They brought their families, told stories about Thomas and Rodriguez and Chen and Washington, ensured the next generation understood what sacrifice meant and how it should be honored. Patricia Chen brought her own children, teaching them about their grandfather who died in Vietnam and the Medal of Honor recipient who'd remembered him for 48 years. "This is what service means," she told them. Not just the moment of heroism, but the lifetime of honoring it. Not just surviving, but living in a way that makes survival meaningful. The airport in Richmond named its Veteran Assistance Program the Thomas Brennan Initiative, training staff to recognize and properly honor Medal of Honor recipients and other decorated veterans. Melissa led the training, using her own experience rushing Thomas through the terminal as a cautionary tale about assumptions and the importance of respect. The scholarship fund established by the survivors grew, eventually supporting hundreds of students descended from Vietnam veterans. Each recipient learned about Rodriguez, Chen, and Washington, about the action that saved 15 men, about Thomas Brennan, who'd spent his life honoring the fallen. The scholarship became more than financial support. It became education in sacrifice, service, and the proper way to honor those who gave everything. Thomas's Medal of Honor was donated to the National Museum of the United States Army, displayed alongside his story, not just the action that earned the medal, but the 48 years that followed. The exhibit included photographs of the 15 survivors and their families, of Rodriguez and Chen and Washington, of Thomas visiting their graves and their families over decades. The exhibit's description read, "The Medal of Honor represents extraordinary valor, but this medal also represents the weight of survival, the responsibility of remembrance, and the dedication to honoring fallen comrades across a lifetime. Thomas Brennan earned this medal through heroic action. He honored it through heroic living." Visitors to the museum stood before the medal and learned not just about combat heroism, but about the costs of heroism, the survivors' guilt, the decades of carrying weight, the transformation of survival into service. They learned that medals came with responsibilities, that recognition created obligations, that true honor extended far beyond the moment of action into the years and decades that followed. The story of Thomas Brennan became part of military culture, taught at service academies, discussed in leadership courses, used to illustrate that heroism included not just extraordinary action, but extraordinary dedication to honoring those who didn't survive. His life demonstrated that the weight of survival could be carried with purpose, that guilt could be transformed into service, that remembrance was its own form of valor. Rodriguez, Chen, Washington, and Brennan, 4 names forever linked by one day in 1971, 3 who died heroically, 1 who survived and spent 48 years proving that survival could be as meaningful as sacrifice, that carrying the weight forward was its own kind of heroism, that honoring the fallen through dedicated living was the truest form of respect. Their collective legacy lived on in 15 families, in 200 descendants, in countless veterans who learned that weight could be shared and survival could have meaning, in airport workers who treated veterans with proper respect, in families who understood their loved ones' sacrifices were remembered, in a nation slowly learning to properly honor service regardless of how wars ended. Thomas Brennan's life proved that heroism extended beyond the battlefield into the quiet dedication of decades, that the Medal of Honor represented not just one extraordinary action, but a lifetime commitment to making that action meaningful. That survival, when lived with purpose and dedication to honoring the fallen, was its own form of valor worthy of respect. The weight remained, always would. That was the cost of survival, the burden of heroism, the responsibility of carrying forward names and memories and sacrifice. But the weight had meaning, had purpose, had created legacy that extended far beyond one man's survival, and that was enough, more than enough, everything. End. For all who carry the weight of survival, and all who honor the fallen through how they live.